welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Jen, your host today of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. And I am joined by, at this point, a friend of the show. You've been here several times, and you are here today with a project that just made my little Trekkie heart so happy. So hello, welcome back. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and the book that you are here with today?
My name is Mike Chen. I am a New York Times bestselling author, and today I am here to talk about the paperback release of my comic miniseries, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Dog of War.
Oh, it is so delightful. I had so much fun reading this and getting to revisit these characters. I am a DS9 super fan. It is my favorite incarnation of Star Trek. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, this might be a big question at the same time, but like your journey to this project and like your personal journey as a Trek fan.
Well, those are two very big questions.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I started off so when I was growing up, my dad was an original series fan, which meant that like I was all in on Star Wars and like not into Star Trek. I got into it more like late TNG. Um, so like I saw all the movies in theaters, and I was really starting to get into it. And one of my nerdy Star Wars friends was also a huge Trekkie, and so he kind of like brought me into it. And then when I met my wife is a huge Trekkie, and so like we just kind of like exponentially accelerated each other there. Um, I had watched DS9 off and on in syndication. It was really hard to watch in syndication. And then I watched more of it when it was on reruns on Sci-Fi in like the early 2000s, but it was still kind of hard to watch. I knew I liked it, and I got like the basics of the story, but like there were huge gaps in it. And then when it finally got on Netflix, I think around like 2009 or so, I watched most of it there. And that's when I concluded that like TNG is my favorite Trek. You know, it's like the one that I feel like the most, they are my first true Trek. But DS9 is by far like the best series in Trek, like in terms of quality of writing and presentation and themes and everything. And I will be on record as saying I think DS9 is the greatest TV series ever made because the fact that it exists coming from like the 90s is just impossible. Like how like the level of serialized storytelling and like the weight of like a franchise legacy in terms of like world building, like all the different variables they had to deal with. A black captain, which not everyone was cool with in the 90s. Um, like the fact that it came out the way that it did is just a miracle.
Mhm. Oh my gosh. I think the distinction that you made was absolutely on point. Because I think I feel similar. Like if I picked a favorite, it's TNG, but DS9 is the best. Like the
Yeah.
TNG cast feels like family and DS9
Hmm.
like my best friends in a good
Yes.
way.
And I will also like not to discount like Voyager at all. So like one thing that happened in the past few years. So I mentioned my wife is a big Trekkie. She had actually never watched DS9 until a few years ago, and I had never watched Voyager. She loves Voyager so much, and we'd always talked about like we have to fill in these gaps within our Trek fandom. And so when like we were at peak pandemic, like 2020, and we're like, we have absolutely nothing to do. So we marathoned, like we first did Voyager for me, and then we did DS9 for her. And then now I would say 50% of our viewing time now is like, do you want to put on a DS9 or Voyager? Just it's our comfort show. And there's so much of it that you can always revisit it and it feels fresh.
Oh, yeah, Voyager is so good too. And
Mhm.
they do such bold storytelling. And it does like, it feels like, you know, each show, even though some are darker than others, like it really does just feel like you're hanging out with a bunch of really good friends who are just like
Hmm.
do their best, you know, and there's something that's
Yeah.
really comforting about that. Um, and I love what you mentioned about DS9 and how groundbreaking it was, both in terms of its serialized storytelling and in terms of the diversity of its crew, and especially having a black captain that was huge at the time, as you said. Um, could you talk a little bit about, oh, one thing I did notice before I move on to that is that as I was reading your story, I
Hmm.
realized that like DS9 was telling stories that took place in our time 30 years after TOS, like right there's like
Yeah.
the Dribble episode where they're paying homage to the original series on its 30th anniversary, and we're now that far removed from DS9.
Yeah.
And so like that show is, it felt so groundbreaking at the time and it still is, but now it's also Star Trek history, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
Like yeah, what was it like to play with these like extremely well-known like characters and worlds, and doing so while honoring canon such that
Hmm.
it is with like a world of time travel, but
Yeah.
also imposing your original voice.
I think so this is my, I guess, third IP project. I wrote, Star Wars short story before this, and then a Star Wars novel.
Mm.
And that kind of gave me a sense of like how it would be creative while respecting like the boundaries of established world building. I will say that with Trek, Trek was not as nitpicky. Nitpicky is not the right word, but like restrictive as Star Wars. Like Star Wars, like had a lot more level of approval to go through. The way that this story came about, so I tweet when I used to be on Twitter more. It's a difficult place right now.
It is.
But when I was on Twitter a lot, and now still, like I guess if you are on Blue Sky, Blue Sky has a good Trek fandom. Um, I tweeted about DS9 a lot, and so my editor, Heather Antos at IDW, she messages me and she goes, "I hear you like DS9," and I'm like, "I love DS9." And so she goes like, "Would you want to put together some pitches because we're going to do a mini series to honor the 30th anniversary?" And so I gave her five different pitches. Um, and I wish I could tell you about the other ones, but I can't. But this one, so one of the pitches was like Court gets a dog, and it was just like a one line like Court gets a dog. And the other one was Cisco salvages some Borg tech that could help win the war, but he has to confront his own, Borg PTSD about that. And so Heather said, like, what if we melded those together? And so I wrote a treatment for that, and that's what became the Dog of War.
It's such a good idea, and I think it does what the show itself did really well, which is like really expertly balancing darker storytelling than Star Trek had really traditionally let itself do, but
Hmm.
also maintaining like some of that like silliness that is sort of also inherent to Trek.
Yeah, it was very important to balance, like, the at first you don't know which is the A plot and which is the B plot. They're both kind of there, but one of them is silly and one of them is serious, and then like they kind of intertwine when you hit the third act.
Oh, it's so much fun. And oh gosh, just like when I was looking at the cover, when it was
Hmm.
me, I was just like Corgi, Borg,
Yeah.
Borgie, like, oh my gosh, this is so great. And I just like I sent all my Trek friends the cover and I'm like, look at this, you need to read this. It's so great. So speaking actually of art and of writing for a
Hmm.
visual storytelling medium, what was the collaboration on this project like? What was it like working with your artists and your colorists and all that, your team?
So that was a new experience for me. So the way that I write prose, I actually write chapters like I kind of skeleton draft them. It's a lot of dialogue, some prose, but also like when my brain's not working for prose, I just like kind of bullet point stage direction. So that adapted really well to comics. The main thing was like understanding that the dialogue had to be shorter, um, and then get into the idea of like 5 to 7 panels, like of breaking up the action. When I turned in my first draft for issue 1, my my editor, Heather, was very gentle with me. She goes, "This is great, but you wrote the first chapter of a book. This is not a comic book." I'm like, "Oh, dang it." So, she kind of talked about like, the pacing had to change, like the stakes had to change, like you basically had to get into things faster. And once I understood that, then the rest of the issues, because they were delivered on like monthly scripts, it came together much easier. So I feel like really confident if they will ever bring me back. And I I think it's okay to say publicly that like I have pitched them like many nerdy stories of like that take place in like the TNG Voyager DS9 timeline, but they're like, we're actually not doing that right now. I'm like, okay, well, just keep me in mind, because I would love to write about, Tom Paris or someone.
Oh yes, oh my gosh. Yeah, speaking of like favorite characters and characters that you want to write about, when you were crafting this story, um, who were your like must-haves? Like were there any like particular
Everyone.
I mean, yeah, it's such a cohesive crew that it really is like you have to, it's like all or none. Um, but were there any that like, all right, let's frame it a different way. Any that were particularly easy or challenging for you to write? Like they're
Mm. The best feedback that I've gotten from Trekkie readers is they say they can hear the actors' voices in the dialogue. And so when they read it, they say it feels like an episode. And that's like the best feedback that I can get. Um, I think like if I wrote a different story, I would probably have more of Garrick and Nog in
Mm.
it. But because like there is only so much space to go, and like the key players kind of change issue per issue. What I try to do is every issue has like a different like one or two highlight characters. So there's like, the Worf hunts down the mercenary like set piece. There is when there's a moment where Kira takes out some Cardassians. And like I wrote in the I wrote in the action dialogue, I said, Kira beats the crap out of the Cardassians. And it was like um knowing that everyone had to have like key moments to like one or two per issue so I could pace it out. Um but that was really important to make sure that everyone like in the core cast got highlights. And like Garrick is in there very briefly, but in a very key, I think, visual scene. um Vic is there. I don't That's not really a spoiler because Vic is on like the cover art, like the back
Yeah.
cover. I will say Vic shows up because Dayton Ward is like one of the overseers of like continuity in terms of like editing. And so when I turned in the draft, he's like, I think Vic would be perfect for this part right here. Like, why don't you just replace like, generic character with Vic? And I'm like, that's brilliant. And so I'm like, Vic with a bunch of dogs. That's perfect.
Was.
Um, so like even though Nog is like, he's just piloting like the Defiant, but even like then I wanted to make sure like, we know Nog is very heroic. He is in like the heroic walking to the Defiant shot. I put it very specifically like Nog has to be there. So things like that where even though like it's the main cast that gets like very significant beats, like the supporting cast that that we all love, like I wanted to make sure like they are acknowledged very specifically in there.
Mm. Yeah, like
I
everybody.
didn't get Rom in there. That's probably like the only person that like
Oh,
I was not able to find a way to squeeze him in.
he was too busy with his union duties, you know. So
Yes, exactly. Forming a union.
so one thing I'm curious about is that as you were writing, when you are writing for not just like a franchise, but for serialized comics,
Mhm.
do you have to balance like Easter eggs for the diehards with accessibility for newcomers or people who are less familiar, or are you pitching this for like the diehards alone? Like, how do you think of your audience when you're writing?
That was something that Heather and I talked about early on. And she said that you have to assume like people it's not like someone's going to go from like, reading something else and suddenly go like, I want to read a Star Trek comic. You're going to read a Star Trek comic if you're a Star Trek fan. But the level of fandom and familiarity, like this had to appeal to someone who just kind of vaguely knew, like maybe they know who Cisco, Dax, and Kira are, but like they don't know like what's the arc of the Dominion War or anything like that. So it was important to include some exposition up front to kind of set the stakes of like where we are in the Dominion War. They let me put in I made up my own star date. So I looked at the Wikipedia of like the star dates for the different episodes. And so this one takes place in season 6, right after the episode His Way. So it's very, very specific in there. But so they let me do that. Then we talked about like the importance of like establishing like the Dominion, like they've just reclaimed the station from the Dominion. That's why it's kind of in a state of disrepair and the war is not going well. And so Admiral Ross pops up in there to basically establish that like the war is not going well. We've lost our troops and things like that. So that way people can understand like the stakes of the galaxy at the time without having to go back and rewatch 6 seasons of DS9. But they should. They
Yeah.
should watch 6 seasons of DS9 because it's the best show ever made.
Absolutely. That's totally true that you should watch all of DS9, but I think it also like it honors the way that the show aired in its day, right? Because if
Mm-hmm.
you were a casual fan in the 90s, you really couldn't go back and watch every
Yeah.
single episode in order. So you're kind of it also like I feel like honors the way that you might have a kind of piecemeal knowledge of a show, even if you really love it, at the time.
Yeah. And for people who are thinking like, I should revisit DS9, I haven't really gotten into it. The strategy that I suggest to people right now is get a watch guide for the serialized story, because the first 2 seasons in particular can be a little rough, as with all Trek. But get a watch guide that breaks it down each season to like maybe 12 to 15 episodes. So each season feels like a modern season length. And then by the time you get to season 3, you're going to feel like, wait a minute, I really love these characters. So then you have this choice where you can go back and just rewatch from the beginning, or you can finish the serialized storyline and then suddenly you have like an extra 100 so episodes to enjoy time with these characters after the main story ends. So I jokingly call it's like DLC on a video game.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this project with us and for, within your body of work, healing the Star Wars, Star Trek wars. Those are very
Yes, I've
you can
written
love
both
both.
now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Am I allowed to ask what you're working on now? What's kind of on your horizon right now?
My next project is a Marvel project.
Nice.
It is there's a 5 book, so prose, not comics. There's a 5 book What If series that changes presents like a what if scenario. The first one is Loki and Valkyrie. The second one is Wanda and Peter Parker. And my book is book 3, and it's Moon Knight and Venom. And when they told me, you want to write Moon Knight and Venom together, and like, so it is actually, it's not a spoiler, it's in the title. It's what if Mark Spector was a host to Venom. And when they told me that pitch, I'm like, I don't need to know anything more. I'm in. This is going to be amazing. And so it's a 5 book arc. There is a connected storyline throughout, framed by circumstances that cannot be revealed yet. But like I definitely have to look at notes from books 1 and 2 to integrate some of the framing into my book. And that comes out in October. Book 1, I believe, comes out in, I believe it's March, and then July, and then October. I believe that's the release cycle.
Wow. That sounds amazing. And, I don't want to, impinge on too much of your time, but if you would like to come back and talk about that sometime in October, I would love to read that and chat
Oh
with you.
yeah, I would totally love to.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for talking about DS9. I can go on DS9 for hours. So
Oh, it's I love that like I can do this on the show and everybody has to listen. It's great.
yes.
So thank you again. And right, listeners, it is now your turn. Go check out DS9, The Dog of War. It is so, so much fun. It's gonna feel like watching like a classic episode of a show that you, I hope, know and love. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.